All right, what we're doing is we're trying to tell some stories of Citrus and Marion County. There's so much information that's available, or you can get it on Google now, and so much is digitized. But some of the history is unknown, and I'm trying to bring back some of the stories of old Florida that are lost. Some of them are lost for a good reason. I'm reading out of the book called Gators, Skeeters, and Mallory, written by Judge E.C. May. I'll briefly give you the story of Judge May. He came to Citrus County in the 1890s and bootstrapped a business from $50. He rented a small room and created his mercantile business. It became very successful. Over time, at the end of the phosphate boom, his business was close to failing, so he read books at night, took the Florida bar exam, and became an attorney later in life. Eventually, he went on to become county judge, state attorney, represented us in the House of Representatives, had a very colorful, eventful life, is a very interesting man. His book is it's pretty amazing, the stuff that happened in my hometown. I want to read a little bit from it. John Fields is probably one of the most amazing gunfighters, bootleggers in Florida that no one has ever heard of. And I'll read it in Judge May's words describing John Fields, and then we'll go on to speak about an unsolved murder that he did not solve in the 1940s. And I came back 50 years later and kind of solved it. We'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, I want to describe John Fields first. This is how he described John Fields. I think the most dangerous and unpredictable man I ever met was John Fields. He was about 5'8", rather thin and wiry, and carried himself well. His left eye was gone, blasted out, he said, by a heavy bullet in a fight. His left hand was off at the wrist, torn off by a shotgun blast in a fight. On his right hand, only his little finger and one next to it remained. His fist and middle fingers were gone well above the knuckles, together with much of the palm. It would appear to a luckier man with two good hands, this man was almost helpless. But John Fields would play guns, pistol, Winchester, or shotgun, with any man on any terms, on the slightest provocation, and he would be a formidable adversary. I have seen John Fields draw and shoot quickly, and as well as the best of them. Excerpts from John Fields and Judge May's book. I'll put the spoiler alert. John Fields was what Judge May called a blind tiger. We'd call him a bootlegger in today's world. He had an office, storefront, bar in downtown Dunnellon. Judge Fields had encounters with him, and ultimately they almost shot each other at one point. John Fields warned him that he was a friend of Judge May whenever he was sober, but he warned him that whenever he was drunk that he thought he was insane and they had shot many men, and that Judge May should always be armed and be prepared to protect himself if John Fields was drunk. Even though we were friends, he was still liable to shoot him. And John Fields did kill many men even after Judge May became his acquaintance. And ultimately, he was killed in a gunfight over a disagreement on who made the best moonshine. John Fields got in the disagreement. The guys shot each other. He killed his adversary immediately. John Fields died 3 days later from a gunshot wound. This is true history in our town in Citrus County is where that took place. Judge May later on, after he became county judge, told the story of an unsolved murder that happened on the Homosassa River, a tributary to the Homosassa River. But suffice to say, they found a body weighted down in a tributary to the river, close to where a big skater slayer was. And apparently someone had shot the man and left him hoping the gator would take care of it. Judge May was called in to Homosassa. They retrieved the body. They brought it to the dock at what is now the main boat ramp at McRae's. So many of the locals piled on the dock to see the body, the dock collapsed. Everybody fell in the water. They had to fish the body back out of the water and get everybody back up on the bank. And he did an inquiry about if anyone knew what had happened. They went to John Fields' home. They could tell that he knew whoever shot him. They had pulled up in a boat. The footprints were there where they had got out, Elsa Head walked out to confront him, and whoever shot him point blank. He obviously knew who it was, came to meet them at the boat and the landing where he lived, and he was shot point blank. Some of the buckshot had passed by him and was in the side of the building. So that's all they knew. They inquired around the town, and no one knew anything. Judge May writes in his book, which was written in 1955, "The murder of Elsa Head is still a mystery, and it's a job for anyone who thinks he can solve it." I'd read this book many times. It's fascinating. It's the history of my home, and I'd read the book many times. And Elsa is an interesting name. Elsa Head. It's a remarkable name that you tend to remember. The idea of solving that unsolved murder was crazy. In the 1990s, I was caretaker of an island on the Homosassa River. And just as a happenstance, I had a freak injury, and I was unable to work as the caretaker of an island. Basically, I was disabled and I lost the use of my right hand for about a year. And so I couldn't stop working. I continued my full-time job, and I've just basically tied my arm up out of the way so it wasn't bothersome, and I just learned to write left-handed, and I continued working. The owner of the island where I was caretaker had asked me if I could do the historical research of this island, and I agreed that I would, but I couldn't work full-time, be the caretaker of the island, and do historical research, not enough hours in the day. After I sustained that injury and I had to learn to write left-handed, I just pivoted from taking down trees and building seawalls to one-handed work of historical research. And really, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I delved into researching the island. I went to the Citrus County Courthouse. I spent many days digging through original records. Some of them had not been, they were deed books, and official records had not been looked at in 50 years. I literally was looking at the original records using cloth gloves to be able to look at the records. They probably don't allow it at all now. And I was able to trace the history of the island all the way back to the Second Seminole War. Fascinating to do the history of the island, and I was thankful to be able to do that and get paid. As a tangent, as I took the chain of title back through that island, I got into the 1940s, and I saw a transfer of title for part of the island to one Elsa Head. And I immediately knew that I would have to go back and reread Judge May's book about the murder. And then I started piecing things backwards. And I had remembered reading in Judge May's book. It was an unsolved murder. Any man thinks he can solve it, go at it. I'll just say here, at that point in time, I was much younger and not quite as wise as I would be now about handling that. So I thought, well, that's cool. I'll just solve this unsolved murder. That's a very high level of not understanding local history in Florida to go resolve an unsolved murder. Don't. For anybody who thinks they're going to do that, just don't. So at the time, I knew a lot of the locals. I spent a lot of time on the water, obviously, as on the island as a caretaker. I knew a lot of folks there. And so I went to some of the old timers, one in particular. One of the fishermen that I had got to know well on the Homosassa River, it goes by Uncle Curtis. If you go to Old Homosassa today, people will still know Uncle Curtis. He was just a fascinating old man. I don't know how old he was. I'm going to say he was in his late 70s or early 80s at that time. But he was still fishing. He was still working. And he was quite an interesting fella. Very hard to get to know because folks like that, they don't let you into their life very well. But I got to know him well for a long time. And Uncle Curtis had taught me how they fish. Before the Institute of the Net Band, he had taken me out to all the secret places that fishermen go to net fish, and he had showed me how they netted fish, how you throw out the let go and circle around in the nets. And then after the net ban, he kind of went back to the old way of catching fish, and he was able to catch fish and no one else could. He had done it so long, he reverted back to the old way of doing it. I thought Uncle Curtis would be a good source to ask about something from that long ago. And so he was the first person I went to. And in conversation, I said, Uncle Curtis, did you know a fellow named Elsa Head? I'm researching the murder that happened here. And Uncle Curtis, I never knew his last name until I asked him that. Uncle Curtis is Uncle Curtis Head. He said, oh yes, Elsa Head was my cousin, and he was doing somebody else's wife. Everybody knew who did it, but he had it coming, so no one said anything. So as I started delving into this unsolved murder, then I really walked into something that was unexpected. When Judge May had come to town to resolve the murder, no one said they knew anything because it was determined by the community. He had it coming. He was doing wrong. The community decided, that's just what happened. So I could have asked Uncle Curtis who did it. He says, oh, everybody knew. He says, yeah, I know who did it. But at that moment, I kind of started getting the hint of, I don't know if I want to know who did it. I started realizing that it's at that time, and even to this day still is, it's a small community. There's only about 5 last names in the community. Everybody's related with each other. And I almost asked who did it, but then maybe I don't want to know. So there was another folks that I knew very well that had lived there their entire life. They were of an age where they would know. They were having a yard sale, so I stopped off and bought a few items at their sale. And while I was speaking to them, I said, hey, I'm doing some historical research. I said, I'm looking into the murder of Elsa Head. Do you know anything about it? And it was a gentleman and his wife. The gentleman took a moment. He said yes. And then there was a very long silence after that. It's that's all he had to say was yes. And then that was at the moment in time where I decided, I no longer want to know. I know all I need to know about this. Now, I was always curious, and I thought about it, and I was kind of curious, just even if I knew just to not tell anyone. I didn't know if I wanted to know. About 10 years after that, I got a random call. I still own some property in Old Homosassa. And ultimately sold it. I didn't go down there. I told the people the price, and they bought it, and it's a boat yard now. It's a commercial property boat yard. And I was speaking to the folks. I said, oh, I loved living in Old Homosassa, and they told me their names. And I said, oh, yeah, I know these folks. And in conversation, it turned out it was Uncle Curtis's family, no surprise. And I said, oh, I inquired because I assumed he had passed. He would have to be very old at that time. They said, nope. He's 93 years old at that time. He says he's 93, so they don't let him drive, so he just bought a golf cart, and he still drives around. He's just never changed a bit. And I got his number, and I was tempted to call him and find out, because I was always curious about who killed Elsa Head. And at the last moment, I said, no, I don't want to know. That was very interesting. I found out where it happened, which was actually very close to where I lived. It's still a natural tributary to the river that's never been built on. It's probably the only creek that runs into the river that's not been built on. And I hiked up in there. I actually know where it took place, and I'm almost certain I'm the only person that knows anything about that story. But that's all I can tell you. But it's a fascinating story, and as I've done historical research later, I use that as a guidepost to ask about details that I didn't want to know. Over the years, that's been 30 years, I've researched lynchings and killings and Klan activities, bootleggers, you name it. I know where there's unmarked graves and a lot of stuff, but that's the guideposts I've used to know how far to delve into things, and on occasion there's things you just don't want to know. But that was my first real learning experience on unsolved murders are real things, and there's real murder still running around out there.